Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime, cults, and heinous history. So if that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss an upload. We're gonna try something a little bit different today. In this video, I'll be telling you two separate stories about early 19th century killers. This will give me a chance to talk about some of the historical cases that I've been wanting to discuss, but I just felt like there wasn't enough information for a full-length video, and there are a couple of similarities between these two killers that you will notice as we move through the stories. So I hope you guys find this one interesting. Let's go ahead and briefly talk about today's sponsor so we can get into these cases. This video is sponsored by Trade. Trade is a coffee subscription service that makes it possible for you to try out unique, delicious, and lesser known craft coffees from all over the country. If you are a regular viewer of mine, you've definitely heard me talk about Trade a lot on this channel. I absolutely love this service. My family and I have been able to try out so many different types of coffees from brands that we've never even heard of. Trade offers over 450 unique craft coffees, and they are roasted to order and shipped to you within 48 hours. So like this one was delivered on August 15th, and you can see here that it was roasted on August 12th, so it's super fresh. And now Trade is making their subscription service even more curated to your needs because they are now offering a variety of theme subscription options. They have several themes to choose from, including bestsellers, single origin, medium, light, and dark roast. They also have an espresso option. You select your preferred subscription and Trade will match you with the best coffees for you. I currently have ours set to ground medium roast because we usually just use a standard drip coffee machine, but a few months ago we got an espresso machine, so I am tempted to change our subscription to the espresso option. I keep seeing this one, it's called Wizard Cat in the espresso category, and I really want to try it mainly because of the name. This is the one that I'm brewing up today. It's called Dad Bod by Sightseer out of Austin, Texas, and I love the description on this one. It says, when you need a cup of comfort, Dad Bod is ready for a big old bear hug. This rich, cozy blend is full of caramelized sugars for a reliable everyday cup. Sounds absolutely delightful. I cannot recommend Trade enough, and if you are interested in stepping out of the ordinary and trying out something new, I highly recommend trying Trade. And you'll get your first bag of coffee completely free when you click the link in the description box or go to drinktrade.com/summer and start your very own Trade subscription. Thanks again to Trade for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into the case. Our first story begins in Germany in 1806. 46-year-old Andreas Bichel and his wife were living in the village of Regensdorf, Bavaria, in a small but comfortable cottage. Andreas worked as a day laborer and he made a decent enough living, but to bring in some extra money, he would often moonlight as a fortune teller. He would go around the village offering up his services to the locals and to travelers passing through. And the Bichels would also make money selling old clothing to the local tailor. Andreas Bichel and his wife were not very liked within the community, and that was mainly because they were both very quiet and very reserved. Where the other people in the village would have their neighbors over for like dinner or tea, or they would meet up at the local pub, the Bichels never did that. Other than the encounters that Andreas had during the day at work or when he was performing his fortune-telling services, he didn't really talk to anyone, and neither did his wife. They were very much to themselves, and the other villagers found them kind of strange. And Andreas didn't have the best reputation around town either. He had been caught stealing on several occasions, but by the early 1800s, his thieving ways seemed to be behind him, and he was now making an honest living, and he seemed to be doing pretty well. So life goes on like this for the next couple of years. Andreas is still working as a day laborer, he's still moonlighting as a fortune teller, and things seem to be pretty quiet in the village of Regensdorf. But that all changed in early 1808 when Andreas meets a 21-year-old woman named Katharina Liddell. Katharina had been traveling through Regensdorf, and Andreas noticed her, and he offered up his fortune-telling services. Now, the way that Andreas would entice potential customers was by telling them about his magic mirror. He would meet a potential customer somewhere in town. He would tell them that he could see into their future if they just agreed to come back to his house, take part in a ritual, and then look into this magic mirror. Fortune telling was definitely a thing back in the early 1800s, but many people were still skeptical. But Andreas knew how to persuade potential customers, especially women. Back then, most women were worried about one thing, and that was marriage. And Andreas knew that he could use this to his advantage, and so he would tell the women that he could see into their futures and tell them who they were going to marry. He preferred to conduct these services while his wife was out of the house, so there would be no distractions, and so he would give his customers a time and date to show up at his house to have their fortunes told. So that day in the village when Andreas met Katharina, she told him that, the only thing she really wanted to know was who she was going to marry. And so Andreas promised Katharina that he could tell her the exact man who would be her future husband, and all she had to do was come to his house, take part in the ritual, and then look into the magic mirror. As tempted as Katharina was, she was still feeling a little iffy about the whole situation. I mean, she had just met this guy. She didn't really know him. She just felt a little strange about the whole thing. And so in the end, she declined the offer and she returned to her home in a nearby village. But a few months went by and Katharina found herself still thinking about that fortune teller, and her desire to know who her future husband would be won out in the end. And so she decided to write to Andreas and let him know that she had changed her mind and she did want to hire him for his services. Andreas had explained to Katharina that as part of the ritual, she was supposed to arrive at his house wearing her favorite dress, and she was also to bring 3 of her nicest dresses with her because this ritual had multiple parts and there would be wardrobe changes. And so Katharina put on her favorite dress, she grabbed 3 more dresses, and then she made her way to Regensdorf to Andreas's home. When Katharina arrived, Andreas took her 3 dresses and her belongings and he set them aside, and then he told her to sit down in a chair facing the magic mirror. He then told Katharina that he would need to blindfold her, and he also needed to bind her hands behind her back just to ensure that she wouldn't get too excited during the ritual and reach out and touch the magic mirror because it would break the spell. Katharina was likely pretty apprehensive about this at first, but Andreas reassured her that this was just all part of the process and that she would soon get to see her future husband in the magic mirror. Unfortunately, Katharina agreed and Andreas secured the blindfold and he tied her hands behind her back. And once she was blindfolded and she was restrained and she was unable to fight back, Andreas then picked up a hammer and bashed Katharina's head in. He then removed her clothing and he began mutilating and dismembering her body. He disemboweled her, he removed her heart, and then he cut the rest of her body into pieces, and he put her remains in an outhouse in his backyard where he and his wife stored their firewood. Then he went back inside and he burned any bloody clothing, and he used lots of soap and water to clean the blood off of the cottage floor. He used so much water in the cleanup that he actually had to sprinkle a layer of sand on the floor just to kind of soak up the excess so the floor wouldn't be completely soaked by the time his wife came back. And apparently his cleanup efforts were pretty effective because his wife seemingly noticed nothing out of the ordinary when she finally returned. But back in Katharina's hometown, her younger sister Walburga was becoming really concerned. She hadn't received any letters from Katharina in about a month, and this was completely out of the ordinary, and so she decided to go out and look for her sister. Now she knew that right before Katharina went missing, she had plans to visit the village of Regensdorf to see that fortune teller named Andreas Bichel. She knew this because right before Katharina left, she wrote her sister telling her all about her upcoming trip and the fortune teller and the magic mirror. So while Berga traveled to Regensdorf, she thought she would start her search there. And as she was walking through the village, she just happened to pass by the local tailor shop and something caught her eye. There was a piece of clothing in the shop that was made from a very distinctive fabric, and she immediately recognized that fabric from one of her sister's dresses. And so she went inside and she asked the tailor whose garment this was, and he said, well, it's actually being custom made for a customer of mine named Andreas Bichel, and he had provided the fabric himself. Walburga knew instantly that something really bad had likely happened. She thought her sister was in serious danger or possibly even dead. And so she went straight to the police and she told them everything. She said, my sister's been missing for over a month. She was going to see this fortune teller named Andreas Bichel, and now her clothing is being used at the tailor shop. I think something really bad happened here. I think my sister's in trouble. You need to help me. So Walburga, along with the police, went over to the Bichel cottage and they started asking questions. Andreas did admit that Katharina had come to his house to have her fortune told, and then he said she ended up staying for a while, for several days in fact. But then she eventually met a man and they ran off together and got married. But there were a lot of inconsistencies in his story. He couldn't even give police a description of this man that Katharina had supposedly run off with, and he just overall seemed very nervous. After this initial questioning, police were very suspicious, and so the decision was made to go ahead and arrest Andreas and his wife, and they were both taken down to the jailhouse. And while they were in custody, a thorough search of the property was conducted and several articles of Katharina's clothing were found. But there was no blood found or any evidence of a struggle or anything that might confirm to police that Katharina was in fact dead. But there was one odd thing. One of the officers had brought his dog with him during the search, and anytime that dog got anywhere near the outhouse in the backyard, he would start barking and sniffing around like crazy. At first, the officers didn't really pay any attention to this, but when the same thing continued to happen throughout multiple searches, they decided to go ahead and take a look in the outhouse. When they opened up the outhouse though, the only thing they saw was a pile of firewood, but the dog was obviously sensing something that the officers weren't, because she just continued to sniff and bark, and she was becoming even more excited. And so the officers started removing the pieces of firewood one by one, and when they got to the bottom of the pile, they could see the ground underneath had been freshly dug. And so they all grabbed shovels and they started digging, and they eventually made a very gruesome discovery. Inside of that hole, they found not only the mutilated body of Katharina Liddell, but they also found the body of a second woman, and the officers were pretty sure they knew who this was. 2 years earlier, a young woman named Barbara Reisinger went missing. The last time anyone heard from Barbara, she was headed to Regensdorf to have a job interview. She had seen an ad in the newspaper that a man named Andreas Bichel and his wife were looking to hire a housekeeper, and so she decided to go ahead and answer this ad and go inquire about this job. When Barbara arrived at the Bichel home, Andreas's wife wasn't there, but he let her in and the two of them started talking. The conversation likely started out innocently, Barbara asking about the position, Andreas asking her questions about herself, but somewhere along the way, the conversation turned towards the magic mirror. Andreas told Barbara that he was a fortune teller and he offered his services. At this point, Barbara was probably feeling at ease with Andreas. They had been talking for a while and he'd been a perfect gentleman, and so she decided to take him up on his offer. He instructed Barbara to sit in the chair facing the mirror, and he told her that he would need to blindfold her, and to ensure that she didn't reach out and touch the magic mirror, he would need to tie her hands behind her back. And unfortunately, Barbara agreed to this. And once she was blindfolded and restrained, Andreas grabbed a knife and he plunged it into Barbara's neck. He then stripped off her clothes, he mutilated her body, he removed her heart and her intestines, and then he dismembered her. He then buried her remains in the outhouse, stacked the hole with firewood, and then he went inside to clean up the blood. Any clothing of Barbara's that wasn't bloodstained was later sold to the tailor, or it was given to the tailor to make new garments. But Andreas went even further with Barbara. He actually wrote a letter to Barbara's parents and told them that she had met a wealthy man in a different town and the two of them had run off together, and that she needed them to send her clothing to Andreas Bichel's house so that he could pass them along to her. At this point, her parents were under the assumption that Barbara had gotten that position as a housekeeper and she had been living with the Bichels. But Barbara's parents couldn't read or write, and so they were pretty confused when they received this letter. They didn't really know how to respond, and so they didn't send the clothing. And so when the clothing never arrived, Andreas got frustrated and he traveled over to Barbara's parents' home and he knocked on the door and he was like, "Why haven't you sent your daughter's clothes? You know, she needs those clothes." The parents seemed pretty confused by the whole situation, but in the end, they handed over Barbara's stuff and Andreas took it and went right back to Regensdorf and he sold all of that too. It later came out that Andreas had attempted to do this to at least a few other women, but those attempts had failed. Either the women didn't show up to their fortune-telling appointments or they had brought another person with them to the appointment, making it impossible for Andreas to carry out his plan. And the magic mirror that Andreas used was just a cheap DIY project involving a frame and a magnifying glass. So once the police had dug up all the body parts from both of the victims, they submitted them for autopsies. And it was discovered that their abdomens had been cut open vertically and their intestines and their hearts were missing. And the doctor concluded that both of the women were likely still alive when the mutilation began. So just an absolutely horrific and terrifying way to go. So the police knew that Andreas was responsible for these murders, but they really wanted a confession. And at first, he wasn't admitting to anything. I don't know how he was trying to explain two dismembered bodies buried in his outhouse, but he was denying everything. And I want to take a minute to recognize the true hero of this story, and that is the dog. That dog had been trying desperately to get the police to look inside of that outhouse, and if she wouldn't have done that, it's very likely that Andreas would have gotten away with another murder, and I have no doubt that he would have killed more people. Now, up until a few years before this case broke, the police were allowed to interrogate people using torture tactics. But by this time, torture had been either completely banned or at least somewhat restricted in Germany. And so police had to figure out another way to put pressure on Andreas. And so they decided to bring him back to his cottage and interrogate him there with the victims' dismembered bodies laid out on his floor, hoping that his conscience would get the better of him if he saw the horrors of what he had done. And this actually worked. Andreas gave a full confession, and when he was asked why he had done this, like what his motive was, he just claimed that he killed the women solely so that he could steal and sell their clothing. However, it is thought that the real motive was sexual in nature, and the clothing was just a secondary benefit for Andreas. Some of the sources say that in Andreas's confession, he admitted that he had mutilated the bodies because he was just curious of what insides looked like. And it's also believed that Andreas fed his victims' missing intestines and hearts to his pigs. When the police asked about Andreas's wife's involvement in all of this, he told them that she knew nothing about it. She had no clue that he had been doing this, and so she was eventually released from custody and no charges were ever filed on her. Andreas Bichel was executed by beheading on June 9th, 1809. And when the Jack the Ripper case was unfolding in 1888, Andreas Bichel's story started to come back up in conversation. It had been nearly 80 years since Andreas had been executed, but people couldn't help but notice the similarities between these two killers. The way that Jack the Ripper was mutilating his victims reminded people a lot of what Andreas had done to Barbara and Katharina. And Andreas Bichel is now known as the Bavarian Ripper. Before we get started on the next case, I do want to let you guys know that we officially have merch. We've been working with an amazing local artist and she created a logo that we love. I wanted something simple and not super spooky, but I did want, kind of a darker vibe. And so we went with a tome with a death's head moth on the front, and it says Crime, Cults, and Heinous History because of course that is what this channel is all about. Right now we have embroidered hoodies, which I have that on right now. We have these in two colors, black and green. We also have comfort colored pocket tees with a death's head moth on the pocket, and then on the back is the full logo. We have those in 3 colors. We have embroidered beanies. I love these beanies. They're super comfortable. They're waffle knit, and you have the little moth embroidered on the front. And we have coffee mugs that come in 2 sizes. And we are currently working on a Halloween design that I'm super excited about, and I will update you guys when that is added to the shop. So if you want to, you can go to shop.summersanchez.com and check it out, and I will also leave that link in the description box. And now let's get into the next case. Our next story begins in 1768 in the village of Asenby, North Yorkshire in England. Mary Harker was born into a working class family, and from the time she was very young, she was described as vicious and dishonest. And Mary also very quickly earned a reputation as a thief. She started off by stealing things from her own family members at the age of only 5, but this escalated to stealing things from people around the community. And by the time Mary was 12 years old, her parents just couldn't take her anymore. And so they made arrangements for Mary to be sent to the nearby town of Thirsk to work as a domestic servant. And for the next 8 years, Mary just hopped from one family to the next, getting fired from multiple positions along the way because she just couldn't help but steal from her employers. And by the time Mary was 20, she had earned such a horrible reputation around the area that she could no longer find employment. Word had spread about Mary, and no one wanted to take a chance on a woman who was likely going to steal from them. And so she made the decision to move to Leeds, which is about 40 miles away. This move would give her the chance to start fresh. No one knew her in Leeds. This is a big city, she thought she could just blend right in. She worked for a while as a seamstress in a dress shop, and to bring in some extra money, Mary also started advertising her services as a soothsayer. A soothsayer is another name for like a psychic or fortune teller, and because Mary was already such a good liar and a con artist, she was able to convince people that she truly had powers and she really could see into their future. She also made love potions and medicines. She even claimed to be able to rid people of evil spirits, and she built herself a full-blown career as essentially a town witch. And there were actually 2 other witches who were operating in Yorkshire at the same time as Mary. There was a woman named Old Nan, whose real name was Nancy Winter, and Old Nan owned a witchcraft shop in the town, and she sold various potions, and she would use cards to read people's futures. And there was also a witch called the Ling Bob Witch, whose real name was Hannah Green, and Hannah used tea leaves to read people's fortunes. Both of these witches were pretty well known around Yorkshire and seemingly well liked within their communities, and so they went on to have very successful businesses for decades. But the same could not be said for Mary, because Mary would use her reputation as a witch for sinister purposes. In 1793, at the age of 24, Mary got married to a man named John Bateman, and they had 4 kids. And you would hope that having a husband and children would have gotten Mary to settle down a bit, but she actually did the exact opposite. First of all, she just continued to steal things from random people. She and John had lived in an inn when they first got married, and stuff just started disappearing from other lodgers' rooms. And then later, when John and Mary had their own place, they would rent rooms out, and Mary would just go into the lodgers' rooms and just take their things. And she was caught doing this on multiple occasions, but Mary would always somehow talk her way out of it. Typically, she would return the stolen items, or she would pay the person off so they wouldn't press charges. And sometimes she would convince her family to just up and move so the victims couldn't find her. And Mary would con her own family as well. One day she came running inside holding a letter, and she was completely frantic, and she told her husband John that the letter was from his father in a nearby town. The letter said that his father was on his deathbed and John needed to go and see him as fast as he can before he died. And so John is completely devastated by this news. He had no idea that his dad was sick, and so he immediately packs up his bags and he makes the journey to go see his dad. But when he arrived, he found his father perfectly healthy. And so John was really confused, and he was like, what's going on here? I thought you were on your deathbed. I left Leeds as soon as I got your letter. And the father was like, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't send you a letter, and I'm definitely not dying. Mary had actually written that letter herself, and she had made up that whole story because she needed to get her husband out of the house for a while. Because by the time John made it back home, Mary had sold off all of their furniture, and she did this because she had to pay off all of the people that she had stolen from. Then in 1796, a massive fire broke out in a local mill, and lots of people died in this fire. And Mary saw an opportunity here. She started going door to door, posing as a volunteer, asking people for donations of linens and money to give to the people people who had lost loved ones in the fire. She actually told one woman that she had found a dead child and she wanted to help his poor mother give him a proper burial, and so she needed donations of linens so they could wrap the boy's body up. The woman gave Mary the linens and she just went right down to the pawn shop and she sold them. And she did this with all of the donations that she had collected, and she just pocketed the money. So you get it, she's not a good person. And as you can imagine, her husband John was not happy about his wife's behavior, and he was getting really fed up with moving around all the time, constantly having to dodge Mary's victims and pay people off. And Mary was really tarnishing the Bateman name. And so in an attempt to escape his problems, he joined the supplementary militia. This would allow John to leave for long stretches of time so he wouldn't have to deal with Mary. So John leaves, and now Mary is left alone to manage the house and the kids on her own. And with John gone, this left Mary totally unchecked. Mary started using fear to manipulate people into giving her their possessions. She would approach married women and she would say, I see that your husband is cheating on you. I can see into your future and he's planning to run off with his mistress. But if you pay me, I'll cast a spell that will prevent this from happening. And so the women would be completely desperate to keep their husbands, from running off with their mistresses. And so they would pay Mary whatever she asked for. And then when the husbands didn't run off with another woman, because there was no other woman, the wives would assume that Mary's spell had worked. And so more and more people started to believe in her. And Mary started attaching herself to families. And she would get really close to these families and just manipulate them using fear. And then once they were broke and had nothing left to give, she would move on to the next family. But to avoid suspicion falling directly on her, just in case something bad happened, she started inventing other witches. And she would tell her clients that this other witch who lived in a different town was the one who was like preparing potions and medicines and stuff. And like I said, she did this just in case something really bad happened. She could blame it on this fictitious witch just to keep her name from being completely tarnished. And in 1803, Mary met two sisters known only as the Kitchen Sisters. The Kitchen Sisters ran a draper's shop in Leeds, and they lived together in a little apartment above their shop. And Mary did what Mary does, and she attached herself to this family, and she got to know them really well. She's convincing them that she's got all of these powers and stuff. And the Kitchen Sisters totally bought into everything Mary was telling them. And so one day, one of the sisters got really sick. And so Mary was like, don't worry about it. I'll stay here with her and I'll nurse her back to health. And I'll even contact my friend Miss Blythe to get her to make up some special medicine. And Miss Blythe, of course, is a fictitious witch. So Mary stayed in the apartment and she appeared to be nursing the sister back to health. She's being super caring and attentive, and she's administering the medicine that Miss Blythe prepared, but nothing was working. The sister was just getting sicker and sicker by the day, and within 1 week she was dead. And just 10 days after that, the other Kitchen Sister and their mother were dead as well. Mary had been slowly poisoning the family with the magic medicine that Miss Blythe had prepared, which was actually just arsenic. Once they were dead, Mary completely cleared out their apartment and the shop, taking all of their possessions. She kept some things, but she sold off most of it and pocketed the money. And to keep the neighbors from going inside and investigating, Mary spread a rumor that the Kitchen family had all died from the plague. And so no one wanted to go anywhere near that apartment. Several weeks later, someone did finally go in to collect the bodies for burial, and they found the place was completely emptied out. Nearly everything was gone. Now, right before the second sister died, she had actually called a doctor, and the doctor left the appointment very suspicious that she was being poisoned. But unfortunately, everyone was dead before he could prove it. He did try to get permission to perform autopsies on the bodies, but he needed permission from a relative, and he couldn't track one down. And so once again, Mary managed to escape justice, and she convinced her husband to uproot the family and move once again. By this time, John was no longer in the supplementary militia. They ended up renting out a place in Black Dog Yard, and it was here in Black Dog Yard that Mary became a prophet. The people during this time in the early 19th century were always looking for a sign that the end of the world was coming, and Mary used this to her advantage. She claimed that she had a connection with God and that he had given her a special hen that laid these miracle eggs with a message from God etched on the shells. And the message was, Christ is coming. And Christ was actually misspelled. It was spelled Christ. And Mary said once the hen laid the 14th miracle egg, that would signal to people that the end of the world was very close. But of course, this was not a special hen. The eggs hadn't been etched by God. Mary had actually been etching the words Christ is coming on the eggs with a strong vinegar solution. And then she would insert the egg up inside the hen. And then later that day, the hen would lay the egg. She charged people a penny to come see the hen and the eggs, and this made her a nice bit of money. But a doctor who lived nearby got really suspicious of Mary, and he actually caught her in the act of shoving the egg up inside the hen. One of the only images of Mary Bateman that we have is a drawing of her holding up one of these miracle miracle eggs. And nothing happened to her after this. She never got arrested or anything for, lying to all of these people and essentially stealing their money. But she was about to claim another victim, and this time she would finally be caught. In 1806, Mary was contacted by a woman named Sarah Steed. Sarah's aunt and uncle Rebecca and William Perigo were desperate to find someone to help them. Rebecca had been experiencing fluttering and discomfort in her chest for several weeks, and she had consulted her doctor, and he told her that she was probably under an evil spell and she was probably possessed, and he couldn't do anything to help her. And so the Perigos thought that they needed someone like Mary, a witch, to rid Rebecca of this evil spirit. And of course, Mary agrees to help because she saw a major opportunity to make some money here. She tells Rebecca that she's going to enlist the help of her friend and fellow witch, Miss Blythe. She says, I'll get with my friend Miss Blythe, I'll fill her in on what's going on, and she'll be able to tell us exactly what to do. But she's going to need one of Rebecca's flannel petticoats so that she can perform a ritual to figure out what exactly is wrong with her. And so they gave Mary the petticoat, and then they went home and waited for further instructions. A week later, Mary told the Perigos that Miss Blythe had sent over 4 guinea notes to be sewn into each corner of their bed, and they couldn't be touched for 18 months or the charm would be broken. A guinea note is about £1 and a shilling. And so Mary went over to the Perigos with these 4 guinea notes in bags, and she sewed them personally herself to the corners of the bed. And then she requested that the Perigos replace the 4 guinea notes that Miss Blythe had fronted them, which they did. Of course, Mary is just pocketing this money, and she kept the flannel petticoat for herself as well. But she knew she could get much more from the Perigos because William had a pretty successful business. And so she knew that she needed to play the long game here, and if she did that, she would have a massive payday. And so she just continued to string this couple along for weeks. She even started sending the Perigos letters supposedly from Miss Blythe herself, requesting various things in order to break the spell. Some of the things that Miss Blythe requested were new shoes, new clothes, money, silverware, tea, cheese, eggs, just like random stuff that Miss Blythe apparently required to break Rebecca of this spell. She even requested a brand new bed and pajamas because she said she was having a hard time sleeping now that she was grappling with this evil entity that had plagued Rebecca. And Miss Blythe would always end every letter by instructing the Perigos to burn the letter after they read it. So this went on for quite a while, and the Perigos were sending Miss Blythe tons of stuff. And Mary Bateman was always the go-between. She was always the middleman in all of these transactions. And then one day the Perigos received a letter from Miss Blythe warning them that a mysterious illness was going to hit their home. And in order to prevent that from happening, they needed to follow her instructions very carefully. The first thing they needed to do was to take a half a pound of honey over to Mary Bateman, and Mary would then mix the honey with some medicine that Miss Blythe had provided. They were also instructed to eat pudding for 6 days straight, and they were told to add this little packet of powder to each one of the puddings before they ate it. And she said it was very important that only William and Rebecca ate those puddings. No one else could eat them. In the letter, Miss Blythe went on to say that they would probably feel a little bit sick after eating that pudding, and if that happened, they were supposed to eat some of that special honey. And she warned them that, whatever you do, don't call a doctor or the charm will be broken. And then, of course, she ended it by saying, make sure to burn this letter. And just like Miss Blythe instructed, the Perigos followed that daily regiment of puddings, and each day they added their little packet of powder and they scarfed it down. However, on the 6th day, the packet of powder had at least twice the amount as the other days. And after adding it to their puddings, it tasted so awful that William could only take one bite. But Rebecca was so desperate to rid herself of this evil possession, and she was trying to make sure that she didn't get even sicker, and so she just forced herself to take 4 big spoonfuls of the pudding before she too couldn't take another bite. And just like Miss Blythe had warned, Rebecca started feeling sick. Her stomach was in knots. She was like projectile vomiting, but still wanting to stay the course. She did exactly what Miss Blythe had instructed, and she ate several spoonfuls of that special honey. William also ate some of the honey just in case he started to feel sick too, but he ate much less. He only took like 2 spoonfuls. But later that night, both William and Rebecca took a turn for the worse. They were vomiting, they had blurry vision, they were dizzy, they had blinding headaches, they could barely function. And so Rebecca ingested even more of the honey in an attempt to stop these horrible symptoms. So by this point, Rebecca had ingested much more poison than William, and her symptoms just got worse and worse. She became very weak, her tongue was so swollen that she couldn't even close her mouth, and she vomited for like 24 hours straight. But she still wouldn't even entertain the idea of seeing a doctor. She was so far under Mary Bateman's spell, and within a day or so, Rebecca Perigo was dead. She had been unknowingly self-administering the poison that killed her. And Mary's very elaborate plan would have worked had it not been for the fact that William Perigo survived. William had not eaten enough of the poison reason to kill him, and now that his wife was dead, he was becoming very suspicious of Miss Blythe, who doesn't exist. On her deathbed, Rebecca had told William not to call the doctor and to keep the faith in Miss Blythe, but William thankfully did not comply, and he did call a doctor. And the doctor told William that he and his wife had very likely been poisoned and he should stop ingesting anything that Miss Blythe had given them. This was devastating news, and William did not want to believe it at first. He was still in a bit of denial, but once he stopped taking the stuff that Miss Blythe had provided, his symptoms miraculously vanished and he fully recovered. And so now he couldn't ignore the obvious any longer, and he pulled those 4 guinea notes off of the bed, the ones that Mary had sewn into their bed on Miss Blythe's orders, and he opened up the bags and discovered that they weren't actually guinea notes, they were cabbage leaves. And the realization that he and his wife had been tricked, they had been slowly poisoning themselves for days, and now his wife was dead, it just hit William like a ton of bricks. So he wrote to Miss Blythe one last time, and in the letter he requested that she prepare him a bottle of medicine, and then he told her a time and place for the handoff. He then went down and told the police everything, and he asked one of the constables to go with him to pick up the medicine. And once William and the constable arrived, they found Mary Bateman standing there with a little bottle of a substance, and this substance ended up being oatmeal mixed with arsenic. And as soon as William walked up with the constable, Mary knew what was happening. She knew that this was all a setup, and so she had to act fast. And so Mary, being the liar that she is, she actually started pretending to be sick, and she was acting like she was about to throw up, and she told the constable that she was actually the victim here. She was being poisoned by William, and that he had given her that little bottle of oatmeal and arsenic. But for the first time in her life, Mary couldn't talk herself out of trouble, and she was arrested. During the search of Mary's house, the police found all the stuff that the Perigos thought they had been giving to Mary to give to Miss Blythe. Everything was in Mary's home: the new bed, the new clothes, the new shoes, all of it. Mary was charged for Rebecca's murder, and the evidence against her was a lot. First of all, they found all of those items in Mary's house. They also found some of that honey in her house, and that honey had been laced with mercury. So she had given the Perigos arsenic powder to add to the pudding, and if they started feeling sick, they were told to take the mercury-laced honey. And William had actually saved that last letter that he received from Miss Blythe. He hadn't burned it, and Miss Blythe's handwriting just happened to match Mary Bateman's perfectly. In the end, the jury found Mary guilty and sentenced her to death. Mary did attempt to at least get the death sentence overturned, and she told the judge that she shouldn't be executed because she was pregnant. So the judge actually ordered everyone in the courtroom to leave, and they locked the doors, and he instructed a panel of 12 married women to examine Mary to see if she was actually pregnant. But after examining Mary for a while, they all concluded that she was not pregnant, and so the death sentence remained. Mary's infant son James, her youngest that she had had with John, actually went to live with her in the prison until her execution date finally came. And apparently this was common practice back then. If there was an infant child who was still nursing, the baby would just go live in the jail cell with his mother. And on March 20th, 1809, Mary Bateman was executed by hanging. There was a large crowd of onlookers during the execution, and many of them later said that they expected Mary to use her powers to escape at the last minute. That's how convinced they were that Mary really was a witch. After her death, Mary's body was handed over to the Leeds General Infirmary, where it was put on public display and people were charged money to see the body. A doctor then dissected her body over the course of 3 days in front of 100 medical students. And later, some of Mary's skin was stripped off and made into leather and then sold as magic charms. Other parts of her skin were used to cover 2 books, and one of these books was allegedly owned by the Prince of Wales, who would go on to become King George IV in 1820. No one knows the current location of either of these books today. Her skeleton and a plaster cast of her death mask was on display at the Thackeray Museum in Leeds all the way up to 2015, when it was then handed over to the University of Leeds, where it is today. Mary Bateman has gone down in history as the Yorkshire Witch. And that is all I have for today. Don't forget to check the description box to get your own trade subscription started, and you'll get your first bag of coffee for free. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.